Hello, my name is Elliot of TallNerdTV and welcome to the GW26 preview video of the EFSA Premier League and Championship matches. We've got a lot of big matches this week, so we're going to get right into it. First of all, starting with our big game at the top of the Premiership as far as TR Kingston is concerned. He's the leader so far, coming up against Fancy Gaffer this weekend. I'm going to highlight Richarlison in this particular match. He's been very disappointing lately, particularly in the double game week that's just passed. He didn't start both games even, so he's very disappointing there. A lot of people brought him in expecting him to be a good asset, but against Watford this weekend, he could have a bit of a point to prove. We've got John on the other side taking a little bit of a punt on Almiron, who I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Newcastle's record signing, of course, yet to play in the Premier League, but could make his debut against Wolves at the weekend. And we move on to our next game, which is the big title match. It's going to have big title implications in the Premier League, at least, between Fuzzy Warbles and WRI Gavin. They're tied at the moment in terms of wins. They're second and third in the table, respectively. I've highlighted Mane in particular for Fuzzy, whose goals have been kind of carrying a stuttering Liverpool team. Considering the start to the season they had, they've really struggled lately for goals, and they've been conceding goals as well, which has been the crucial point. Whereas Gavin's team may lack superstars, but there's definitely potential, I would suggest, for an overall solid score, particularly with Bednarek, strangely enough, a very cheap asset in FPL, who's kind of come into the fore recently for Southampton and has been racking up some decent points. Now we move on to the third game between Nostradamus and Roger Zedrick. We have Son on one side, who is very much the main man for Tottenham at the moment, and looking like he is kind of reveling in the role of being the saviour, which I imagine, given his the size of his profile in South Korea, is something he's very used to, particularly when he plays with the national team, and he's just been playing with them, of course, in the Asian Cup. So he's gone from being the hero of his country to being potentially the hero for his club. It's been a bit of a seamless transition for him, you could say. Jimenez on the other side, I would suggest, for Roto Zedrick, he's had a fantastic season. He's been bringing in the points kind of left, right and centre. And then you've got Leroy Sané, of course, on the team as well. And it's just a case of what might have been. Oh dear, for the double game week, scoring basically nothing in what was expected to be an absolute goal fest for him. But we move on to the next game here between Ben Dinnery and Nick Arg. Nick Arg has several players, I would suggest, with very favourable fixtures here, so he should rack up a decent score and pull himself out of the relegation trouble he currently sees himself in. But it's a case of, for Ben, how many will Fulham let in against Marcus Rashford, and will that usually stoic defence stand up as well as it usually does, considering the fact that obviously Man City and Chelsea are going to be playing each other, and already has Ederson in goal and David Luiz on his defensive roster. So it could be interesting to see how that one turns out. It could be a little bit of an upset on the cards even. We move on to the next game. That's not meant to be the table next, that's coming afterwards. The final game in the Premier League between TA Mac 10 and Jason UK 17. Now Jason is in relegation trouble himself. He's done what most teams in relegation trouble do in real football, which is going to take a punt on a couple of signings, and he's brought in Tielemans, who's playing for Leicester, of course, brought in January, yet to play in the Premier League, but he's also brought in Batshuayi, who I would suggest looked pretty good in his very brief cameo, only 8 minutes for Crystal Palace, but looked very lively. He may well have a point to prove, actually, against all of the people who've kind of doubted him so far during his time in England. But yes, that will wrap it up for the Premier League, and let's have a look at the table here. Like I mentioned, three-way tie at the top. TR Kingston, Fuzzy Warbles and WRI Gavin, all on 15 wins. About 200 points at each stage. separating them. So that is the kind of tiebreaker, as it were, when it comes to win ties. And then you got the relegation battle at the moment being between Nikag, Jason, Rotozegdroik and TA Mac 10, along with Fancy Gaffer, who, like I said, if he can bring a little bit of an upset and beat Todd in the game this weekend, then we will have a new outright leader in the EFSA Premier League. But it's just a case of who wins out of Fuzzy and Gavin, which makes it very, very interesting indeed. So we move on to the first game in the championship for this weekend between CJ Radoon and Gary Irwin. Now, Gary's misfits, as he calls them, not me, they might not pull up trees this week necessarily. I'd expect a pretty tough game actually against this CJ Radoon team. But I mean, particularly, I should say, with Sterling and Zaha on his team. But we should have a moment of appreciation for Tom Heaton, who, since he came back into the Burnley team, has near enough single-handedly turned around Burnley's fortunes, it seems like. Of course, that won't be the case, but it just seems as though the old Burnley is back. It's just a bit strange that changing from Joe Hart to their usual goalkeeper has had such a profound effect on their form. But we move on to the next one here between Fancy Yamar and Jay Forker. Now, this is actually an interesting game because it's the top two teams in the championship playing each other this week. It ought to be pretty close as well, looking at both of the teams. Good defensive fixtures on both sides for the most part, and attackers who potentially could do damage. This will definitely be one to kind of keep an eye on over the course of the weekend. I honestly am not brave enough to make a prediction, so I'm not even going to try. But I hope that we see a good game and a very high scoring match. We'll have a look at it during next week's preview, of course. We'll review all of the results from the previous week because there's a lot of important results going on. So, the next game is between Tom Sunderland and Sports by Gotti. Now, these two teams involved in a big trade on Sunday, I believe it was, this week. Tom trading Callum Hudson-Odoi and Marcus Alonso in exchange for Sports by Gotti's Mohamed Salah, which is obviously a huge trade. And these two teams are both very much involved, I would suggest, in the promotion race in the Championship to decide who goes up to the Premier League next season. Whoever gets the better part of the deal this week could end up having a huge say on what happens for the rest of the season. But I wouldn't have thought that Alonso and Hudson-Odoi would do particularly well this weekend just because they're visiting Man City, and that's obviously one of the hardest fixtures you could have in football this season. But down the stretch, it could be very interesting to see. But we move on to the next one here with Roto Wire Andrew and FPL MNOP. And you got to highlight Sanchez whenever we talk about Smokey's teams. Sanchez always comes to the fore, and you think maybe this is the week that he turns it around. You'd hope that when Solskjaer came in and the upturn in Manchester United's fortunes and results came about, that Sanchez might have his own sort of turnaround in form, but it just hasn't materialised, unfortunately, and he just looks like a player who's absolutely done. At least for this season, he looks like he needs a pre-season to just kind of rest and not do an awful lot. Whereas on the other side, you got Paul Pogba, who's been a man possessed all of a sudden. He seems like he just remembered how to play football. Whether that's, the fact that he didn't like Mourinho, maybe wanted to kind of play him out of a job, as it were. We don't know. But at the moment, he's in really good form, and Roto Wire Andrew is definitely reaping the benefits of it. So on our next game here, we have DFS Hambazaza against Neil Thurman. It's the final game of the weekend, and it would be unfair of me to call it a battle of the basement, but this is 2 out of the 3 bottom teams in the Championship this season, so call it what you want, but there isn't an awful lot to play for on either side. But I have highlighted 4 players who I felt, or who I feel even, have had a very successful season, regardless of the teams that they're playing for. David Brooks of Bournemouth, as well as Jota of Wolves, have been very good, as as well as Sissoko for Spurs and Aaron Wan-Bissaka, who's having the season of a lifetime, a converted right winger, now playing right back for Crystal Palace. Looks like he's been doing so for 10, 12 years. There's 4 players who've either come from nowhere and had a good season, or have kind of succeeded in the face of adversity, and it's been good to see, I think, for both of these teams, and they've been reaping the benefits, I should say. And here we have the table for the Championship. Last look at it before the weekend's fixtures. Obviously fancy Yamar sitting at the top, still with that 2-game lead, but it's the second and third places that are really interesting, because obviously they will play each other in the playoffs, if you can call them that, for the second promotion spot to the Premier League. Anyone from 5th upwards, I would suggest, is actually probably going to feel as though they have a chance of being involved in that hunt. So anyone from Gotti upwards is going to feel like they can maybe make a push for it. But we will have a much better idea of that after this weekend. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoyed the games this week. I should see you next week for another preview video, and we'll of course recap the results of this week. Until then, I hope you have a good one. I will see you later. Bye bye.